Hi, I'm Alan Gassman, and I want to thank Interactive Legal for letting us use their studio here at the Heckerling Institute. I'm here with one of my favorite people, Professor Jerry Hesch. And for many years, Jerry has been telling me about how amazing Phil Heckerling was in so many different ways, and how many tens of thousands of lives have been changed because of what Phil Heckerling did, what he believed, and how he communicated. So I asked Jerry to come here to the studio to talk about how the Phil experience occurred and how we can all learn from that. So Jerry, can you tell us first, when did you first meet Phil Heckerling? Tell us about that event.
Well, I was teaching in upstate New York at the time. Union University had a law school in upstate New York, and actually Union University at that time was very famous because that was the campus that they filmed Love Story at.
Oh.
It's a little trivia. But in any event, I was speaking at a conference in New York City on partnership tax. And after the conference, this gentleman comes up and says, "Hesch, you're pretty good." I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm Phil Heckerling from the University of Miami," in his gruff voice. And I said, "Oh, pleased to meet you," and everything. He said, "You know, you're pretty good." And I said, "Why?" He said, "I don't know a thing about partnership tax. And normally I was expecting to fall asleep. But you actually explained it in a way that I really understood it. And I really like the way you present." I said, "Well, I'm a teacher. That's what I'm supposed to do. You know, I'm teaching basic income tax to the fine arts majors of the world. You got to be able to communicate. It's not what you know." So Phil said, "You know, would you be interested in becoming a visiting professor at the University of Miami Law School?" And I'm thinking, hey, wait a minute. I grew up in upstate New York. I went to school out in the Midwest. Who the hell wants to go to Miami? So I wasn't terribly interested. But he kept pestering me, and I'll get into that story later. But Phil liked the fact that I was able to take very complex subjects and deduce them into a very understandable manner. And it all came from one thing, and this is what Phil liked about me, and this is what Phil always wanted people in the profession to understand, is we have a statutory regime, the Internal Revenue Code, and regulations that interpret a statute. And Phil's philosophy was the Internal Revenue Code is nothing more than codifying fundamental principles of income taxation and transfer taxation. And the key should be not what does the statute say. Don't look at the code and regs first. What are the fundamental principles? And once you communicate the fundamental principles in an understandable manner without using technical terms, the idea is then people will understand the concepts. Then and only then do you look at the code and regs to see how these principles are codified and interpreted. That was Phil's educational goal, one of his educational goals in what ended up being the University of Miami Estate Planning Institute. It wasn't named the Heckerling until several years after Phil passed away at an early age, at age 62, from cancer. So that's how I first met Phil, and we'll get more into how I ended up on the Miami faculty later.
So how did the Institute start?
Well, actually, the first thing is, how did Phil end up in Miami? Phil was born and bred in Brooklyn, New York. And everybody always said you could take Phil out of Brooklyn, but you couldn't take the Brooklyn out of Phil. During World War II, Phil got drafted, and his training was in Miami, because that's where they were training everybody. And during World War II, Phil was stationed in Miami. And at that time, he had just married Ruth, and they had 2 little kids. And Ruth loved the fact that she didn't have to put the kids into winter clothes. They could let them out. They could go outside, and instead of being in the snow. They would jump in the pool. So after World War II ended, Phil went back to New York and and finished up law school. And Ruth was always complaining about, why are we living in New York when we could be living in Miami? And so she kept hawking him, and he finally said, okay, we're moving to Miami. And so that is how Phil ended up in Miami, was because he got used to living in Miami during World War II, and they eventually moved to Miami. And when Phil moved to Miami, he was like a recent law school graduate, and he was always interested in what I call family planning. We didn't call it estate planning at that time, they called it family planning. And he ended up practicing law for a law firm, and Phil always was so intellectually curious that he never had enough billable hours. So he eventually got a job with a local Miami bank that had a big trust department, and Phil became their chief trust officer. And as the years went by, Phil, in order to promote business, started to have local educational meetings for the local lawyers and insurance people and financial advisors at his bank's facilities. He started this, I think, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And it was a nice way to, so he would bring in local lawyers to use his trust company and everything. And it was going over very well. And every year they started getting more and more people. And every year, as word got around, it started to attract people from not just Miami, but throughout the state. People would actually come down to Miami for these local programs that Phil's bank was having. And one time in the 1960s, and Phil was always going to CLE programs around the country, mainly to get ideas, because Phil was always learning. He said the only way you can learn, nobody creates stuff by themselves. Phil said, I never came up with an original idea myself. I always read and listened. He was a voracious reader. He would have journals and articles all over the place. And this is where, before photocopying, it was on these wet sheets and everything. And he attended a continuing education program in New York City. And he listened to some guy do current developments by the name of Richard Covey. And Richard Covey, during current developments, had this massive outline on current developments. And Phil said, this guy is amazing. So he invited Richard Covey down to speak at his local programs. Now, what it was interesting is, during the 1960s, snowbirds would come to Miami for Christmas vacation, and as soon as New Year's came, they would go back to New York and other places, after vacation, and then they would come back for the rest of the season in mid-January. And so what happened is all the hotels in Miami between New Year's Day and the middle of January were half empty.
Oh, that's really interesting.
So Phil got the idea is, since all these hotels had these half-empty rooms between like January 1st and January 20th, he started to put it all together. Also, he noticed that every once in a while at his lower programs, his local programs, there were always people from Minnesota there, in the winter. He said, why are you here in Minnesota? You're from Minnesota. Why are you coming to a program in Miami? He said, because it's cold in Minnesota. So he put it all together. And he essentially said the hotels are empty in this period, so you can get really cheap hotel rates because they're filling empty rooms. There were lawyers from Minnesota and other winter states that would love to come to Miami, between, the first 2 weeks in January. And where else could they have a vacation week in Miami and take a deduction for it?
Right.
So the first institute was in 1966, and it was not that big, and it was. But let me get into a little bit background, because Phil always wanted to become a teacher. He loved teaching. He loved the intellectual exercises and the ability to read. If Phil once said to me that if he wasn't a tax lawyer or estate planning lawyer, he would have become a rabbi to study the Talmud. Okay. I guess it's the same kind of study. So what Phil did is he wanted to go into teaching, but he didn't have what he thought were the credentials for teaching. So he took a leave of absence from his bank, schlepped everybody up to New York, and went to the NYU LLM program full time. And Ruth said, "We're going back to New York for a year in the winter." Phil said, "Don't worry, we'll come back." Okay. So, but there's one funny story, because Phil had a habit of bothering all his professors. And he never accepted anything for granted. He would always ask the professor, "What did you mean by that?" Or "What's your authority for that?" And one day, one of his professors made a statement in class that Phil questioned. And he wasn't sure, so he went back into the tax management portfolios, which had just been started at that time, and learned from reading this portfolio in the early days of the portfolios that the professor made a mistake. So he went back to class the next day with the portfolio in hand and said to the professor, "Here's the authority for your statement." And they got into a big argument, of course, and the professor said, "What are you? You're just a little pisher from Brooklyn. I can't mention the name of the professor because everybody would know him. But you can imagine by the reference who it was." And so the professor happened to be friends with Leonard Silverstein, who was the founder of tax management and developed all the portfolios. So the professor went back, called up Leonard Silverstein, and Leonard Silverstein listened to the professor and said, "Phil's right. My portfolio is right." So, but basically it's right there in the portfolio. So essentially, Phil went back, so he now had the LLM degree from NYU. And at that time, it was Jerry Wallace's program. The founders of the NYU Tax Institute were Jerry Wallace and Jack Bierman. And I think they founded the Institute in 1947 or 1948. Okay? So with an LLM in tax and a moderately successful trust company CLE program, Phil approached the dean of the University of Miami Law School at that time, this was before Soyomechikov became dean. At that time, the dean was Fred Lewis was the dean. And he approached Fred Lewis and said, "Listen, right now, trust and estates is being taught by some adjunct professor. I want to come to teach trust and estates." And he explained to Fred Lewis the vision he had for an estate planning institute. Because all the other CLE programs, if you went to the NYU Tax Institute, it was 5 days. They spent 1 day on trusts and estates. You go to Southern Federal, 1 day on trusts and estates. All the programs, trusts and estates was like a throwaway. And Phil convinced Fred Lewis that Miami could be in the forefront of really developing a burgeoning area, especially, you have to remember at the time that the people who came back from World War II and started businesses were, by the 1960s, started to accumulate wealth. And Phil was part of that generation. He understood that generation, and he said they need that advice, but we have to train that profession. Now, at that time, the University of Miami had an LLM program in pure taxation, which was an old line program. As a matter of fact, at that time, there were only 2 tax LLM programs in the country, NYU and the University of Miami. And Fred Lewis said, "But why do we need a separate estate planning program?" I'll get into how he formed the LLM program in estate planning, because that was formed in 1976. And so Phil convinced Fred Lewis that we need this institute. And of course, Fred thought, it'll make money. Oh, good idea. So Phil was hired and was given the authority to start the University of Miami Institute on Estate Planning. And the first institute was in 1966, coincidentally, the first week in January. And it turned out over that Christmas vacation, they had a huge snowstorm and the Midwest was freezing cold. So the first thing Phil had to do was get a hotel. And at that time, the Fontainebleau Hotel was too fancy a place for Phil's crowd, to be honest with you. I think they wanted $80 a night for a room in 1966.
That's a lot of money in 1966.
Yeah. So what Phil did, Marty Kaufman, who was a family friend, who was a friend of Phil's, I think Marty's kids and his kids were the same age, so that's how he knew it. Marty Kaufman was the manager of the Sheraton Bell Harbor. So he went up to Marty Kaufman, and on a handshake, they negotiated a contract so Phil would have the first institute in 1966 at the Sheraton Bell Harbor. Okay, but Phil realized he needed more than just Miami in the winter, cheap vacation. So he basically had to reach out to big names that would attract people. And in those days, you know, there was no Jeff Pannell. All there was Pannell Sr. You know, Jeff's father was a very famous tax law professor who was famous for partnership tax.
Great treatise.
Was one of the most famous tax lawyers in the country. And that's why Jeff went into estate planning. Oops. But in any event, so Phil said I needed more than just Covey, because Covey wasn't very well known outside of New York City at that time. So he reached out to national leaders in the estate planning profession. And the first few institutes included Ed Schlesinger, Renee Wormser, Ed Hallback, John O'Byrne, and then there was this young professor at the University of Texas that Phil liked. His name was Stan Johansson, so he has Stan Johansson, and then he said there's this other practitioner I really like, Burl Abbin, and then there were a few people. They said I need some youngsters as well. So there was a professor at Washington University in Seattle, John Price, and then there was this young lawyer in Seattle he also liked. So he wanted some youngsters on the program, so he got somebody by the name of Mal Moore and John Price.
That's amazing talent.
Yeah.
That is amazing
And this is what Phil assembled, which was fantastic. And then there were some other people. There was the estate planning professor from the University of Michigan who passed away early. There was the head of the T&E practice group at McDermott, Mac Trapp. This is the kind of people that Phil was bringing in. There was only one big name that said, I'm too good for Miami, and he wouldn't come to Miami. Do you know who that was?
No.
James Kasner. Who else, you know? So he couldn't get Kasner. So he had the first institute in 1966. And Phil's mission was actually very, very interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the early Sheraton Bell Harbor days. Now, I got all of these stories from Phil when I joined the Miami faculty in 1980. So this is all secondhand. Well, up until Phil died in 1983, this was his philosophy. Because people were practicing estate planning without having enough exposure. And there were people who were using techniques in one part of the country and nobody knew about it in other parts of the country. Like he brought John Cohan in to do what was called estate freezes. John Cohan was a lawyer with Ira and Manella in Los Angeles. Now, unfortunately, all these people that I'm mentioning, unfortunately, most of them have passed away. But these were the giants in the field, and Phil brought in the giants in the field. NYU was still bringing in, people from the New York area and wasn't really reaching out to people from all over the country. And Phil realized if I'm going to attract people from all over the country, I should bring in names from all over the country. except he couldn't get Kasner. Well, there's no big deal. Okay, so, but Phil's idea was the profession wasn't getting the information. They didn't know what was going on in other parts of the country. Nobody knew about estate freezes in New York because it was done by Cohen in Los Angeles. And his firm was a LA-based firm with one office in Los Angeles and another in Beverly Hills or something. That's when Beverly Hills was like a different country than downtown Los Angeles. And so Phil's mission was to educate the profession so that they could practice at the highest level of competence. He wanted to make sure that people who are practicing estate planning had all the information they needed. That was his mission. And it was a training session. It was to teach people using Phil's philosophy of teaching principles and concepts and ideas, and not talk about how many angels fit on the head of a remainder interest in a Cupid.
Right.
So basically, it was. But at that time, it was known as the Institute for Advanced Training, because in the early days, if you went to the Institute, there were no basics. It was all advanced concepts. Estate freezes, nobody knew about estate freezes. And you have to remember that also in 1969, the major legislation in the charitable area, because there were all sorts of charitable abuses going on, remember, charitable annuity trusts and charitable remainder trusts enacted in 1969 were nothing more than the same thing that was incorporated in 1989 into GRATs. You know, a charitable lead trust was the same thing as a GRAT, except the annuity interest goes to charity instead of being retained. So what happened is that it was a wonderful opportunity to bring the whole country together. And I think, and NYU was starting to do that, but, NYU did not have the advantage that Phil had. Miami in January.
Right.
Nobody from Minnesota is thinking, in the fall, I'm going to go to New York in October. But I'm going to go, in January, I'm going to go from Minnesota to Miami. That's a great idea. Now, basically, Phil wanted the profession to be practicing at the highest level of competence, okay? But not only did you have to be technically proficient, but he said, these are the people who are going to be making the laws in the future and are also going to be monitoring the profession to make sure the profession was honest. So ethics was extremely important to Phil. And Phil always had people talking about ethics. And he always would bring in somebody to talk about policy considerations as well. The problem with a lot of the CLE programs today, except the University of Miami and a few others, it's more technical training. What does the latest cases say and the implications of it, which is all well and good, but you have to add something extra. And so he would bring in ethics and tax policy. And that was unheard of in those days, because remember, at that time there was no mandatory CLE requirements and no ethics requirements. Now, Phil was also ahead of trends, because if you looked at all of the programs around the country, there was one unique feature of all the programs around the country which you don't see today. What do you think that was?
I don't know.
All the speakers were male.
Oh.
And Phil said, this is ridiculous, because the best handholders that I know are women. Men can talk about, husband, and you have to remember the 50s and 60s was a different era. And so Phil was the first national CLE program. NYU had a few people because, they had a lot of fine women lawyers like Ruth Shapiro in New York City. But Phil insisted that we have women speakers. and he was ahead of his time, okay? Now, here was something interesting. Phil viewed the Institute as education for the profession, to make sure that they know what's going on, so they have all the new techniques, they know how to do all the new techniques and practice at the highest levels. The Sheraton Bell Harbor only held 1,000 people in the big room, and there were no extra rooms. And the entrance to the Sheraton Bell Harbor was very small, and that's where he put the exhibitors. So he had maybe a dozen exhibitors. That's all he could fit. And all these other exhibitors were clamoring to exhibit at the Institute, because by that time, by 1980, the Institute was drawing 1,000 people. And people were clamoring to become exhibitors. But Phil kept it at the Sheraton Bell Harbor with limited exhibitor space because he didn't want the exhibitors to be a distraction for his speakers.
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
That is very interesting.
So as a result, the exhibitor space was very limited. You walked in, there was only one hallway, so it was a mob scene anyway. And so with limited exhibitor space, that means you had to go in and listen to his speakers and not be distracted by exhibitor's booth, okay? And what's also interesting, in the early Sheraton Bell Harbor days, there was no lunches, no breakfast, no dinners. Phil would not have anything to do with that. If you came down to the Institute, they had a continental breakfast for everybody, but lunch was on your own, but the hotel had sandwiches, and dinner was on your own. And Phil said, that's what I want. I don't want people to be distracted. It's good. Let them go mingle out. Let them go visit their grandparents in Miami Beach. At that time, everybody was in, your grandparents were in Miami Beach, and they would go to Junior's and the Rascal House and all that. Let them go there. That was what Phil said. Now, here's what's interesting, how I came to Miami, okay? So Phil kept hawking me to come to Miami and I said, Phil, I'm not really an estate planning lawyer. I've been teaching, true, I teach estate and gift tax, but I don't teach estate planning, and I don't know all this stuff. I have a nice conceptual course on estate and gift tax, but I teach partnership tax, corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions. I do accounting for lawyers. My specialty is partnership tax. This was in the fall of 1979. I said, why the hell do you want me to, I'm sorry, why the expletive deleted? Wait, let me, this is being recorded, right? Okay, I have to watch my language. Why the expletive deleted? See, that's politically correct. Yep. Why do you want me to come to teach in the JD program and the LLM program in estate planning when my expertise is partnership tax? And Phil's answer was, the estate planners are starting to use family limited partnerships for estate planning for discount purposes, and they haven't a clue of what partnership capital accounts are. And I want you to really teach partnership tax at the University of Miami Law School, and also communicate to the estate planning profession what partnership tax is about. Now, it was interesting, to Phil, everybody was a young man. Remember, young man, First Institute, he got this young guy, Mel Moron, who just, I think, turned 80. And Mel's here, of course. And so Phil said, there's a young lawyer in Houston, Texas, I want to introduce you to, who's starting to use partnership tax for estate planning discount purposes, and I want to introduce you to him. Now, who do you think that was?
That was Stacy Eastland.
Stacy Eastland. So Phil, one of the things that Phil did, which was fascinating, is he put together all these, what he called great minds and me, okay? He called me a little pisher. That's a, expression. And he put together people from all over the country to discuss concepts. And it was amazing how at the speakers' dinner, I remember I was sitting there in awe because he invited me to the speakers' dinner as a faculty member. I was sitting in awe at all these, intellectual giants saying, I don't know this. What do you think about that? It was fascinating. Now, here's what's interesting. So I joined the University of Miami Law School faculty in the fall of 1980. So I attend my first institute in January of 1981. And it's at the Sheraton Bell Harbor, and it's full. There's 1,000 people there. And I see everybody sitting there. It's all in one room at that time. And they're all sitting there listening to speakers. I listen to Covey. I can't understand too much. And all these speakers, so I start pestering Phil. Why don't you put me on the institute? And Phil said, well, Jerry, I don't know how you'll do in front of a big audience. Let me get you on a minor league program to see how you do. And if you do well in a minor league program, then I'll put you on the institute. 2 weeks later, this is Phil's idea of a minor league program. 2 weeks later, I get a call from Nick Liakis, who's the director of the NYU Tax Institute, who said, Phil Heckerling said to put you on the NYU Tax Institute. That was Phil's idea of a minor league program.
They were his warm-up band.
That was my warm-up band. So the next year, I'm on the NYU Tax Institute on a partnership panel. And on the partnership panel is myself, who no one ever heard of, okay, Ruth Shapiro, who is one of the leading partnership woman tax lawyers in the country, Richard Cohn, who is the reporter for the American Law Institute's revision of Subchapter K, and Larry Katz, who's one of the leading partnership tax lawyers out of Baltimore, Maryland, and me. So Phil describes the panel, and this is Phil's expression: 3 big mockers and a little pisher. Wonderful, Phil. Okay. So now, at that time, NYU was in the Grand Hyatt, and there were like 1,500 people in the room, but it was a long, thin room, and in the back, you couldn't see the people in the back of the room because they were so far away, and the room was filled. And I'm kind of nervous because, this is the first time I've ever spoken at a major program, and I'm the last speaker. I follow Richard Cohn, Ruth Shapiro, and Larry Katz, who are all wonderful presenters, and everybody knows them. And just as I'm about to speak, nobody was in the front row, Phil walks in and sits down. And there he is, looks up at me, smiles. I look at Phil, and now I'm really nervous, okay? And so I start speaking, and fortunately in partnership tax, Ed Schlesinger just told me, here is how the key so everybody will think you're a good speaker. He gave me a little pep talk. Always tell people what page in the outline you're on, and therefore they'll think you're a good speaker. So I saw Phil, and I started speaking, and I did. 10 minutes later, I look over, and Phil's gone. And I panicked. Oh my God, he listened to me for 10 minutes, and he left. I must be a disaster. But I went on, and afterwards, I said to Ruth Shapiro, Phil left after 10 minutes. And Ruth said, didn't you know Phil is hard of hearing and he won't get a hearing aid? So what he does is he brings in his tape recorder, puts his tape recorder in, and then goes out into the hall to schmooze. So Ruth said, did he leave his tape recorder? I said, yeah. She said, you're okay. That was Phil. And so everybody, after I'm through speaking, which was fascinating, nobody comes up to me. Everybody comes up to Phil and says, Hesch did a good job. So it was like a bar mitzvah when everybody congratulates the parents. But the key is Phil had a vision. And his vision was something that was sort of to take the estate planning profession that was scattered all over, and nobody was paying attention to it except one day here and one day there at all these programs, and have just an institute for estate planning. Because if you were interested in estate planning, you're not going to go to NYU for 5 days just for one day. And it was amazing. And Phil always said putting on the institute was like putting on a christening or bris, a bar mitzvah, or a confirmation, a wedding, and a funeral, arranging a Shiva call all in one.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, that's how View viewed it. And then he always, for the first Monday, right after current developments, they would have in the exhibitor hall all these refreshments. And Phil would say, the problem was that everybody would line up, and they would all line up first at the shrimp table to take, so all the shrimp were gone in 10 minutes. Because Phil also had the habit of treating everybody like family. And he knew there were people who were coming there every year. Phil knew them all by name. They were his friends. And, how was your kids? See how, he treated it like a family function. Phil basically said, it's like my daughter's wedding, my daughter's, bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. That's how Phil treated the Institute. Everybody felt very at home. And his advisory board, it was all, at that time, it was all these wonderful people. And the nice thing about the advisory board, because I remember Phil introduced me to John O'Byrne. John O'Byrne wrote the seminal partnership tax treatise before Arthur Willis's treatise came out. It was Pannell and O'Byrne, put out by the American Law Institute. And so Phil introduced me to John O'Byrne, and I was teaching partnership tax for the first time, not having ever taken partnership tax, so I had to learn partnership tax by teaching it. And every week, I would call up John O'Byrne before I taught my class to ask all these questions. Phil was so gracious. He wanted people to be able to work with each other to talk about ideas. And that was his vision. And when Phil died in I have to tell you about how the estate planning LLM program was founded. So there were a lot of people, because at that time, the Institute was known as the Advanced Institute. You didn't go there to learn basics. You went there for advanced training. And a lot of people would go to the Institute and say to Phil, it's wonderful, but I don't have the background. So Phil was talking to, at one institute in 1975, and was telling, it was Renee Wormser and Ed Schlesinger and Ed Hallback. They were having lunch together. And Phil was telling everybody, the people, a lot of people of this. And Ed Schlesinger said, why don't we have an LLM program in estate planning? And Phil said to Ed, that's my idea. So Phil took credit for it, but it was really a collective effort. And so the very first LLM program in estate planning started in the fall of 1976. And we are fortunate to have, who comes every year, the first graduate of the LLM program in estate planning, Ted Atlas in Denver, Colorado. And you look at Ted says, I was like the youngest person in the program at that time. Now I look around and I'm like a senior person here. It's amazing what Phil has accomplished. So Phil's vision with the graduate program in estate planning was to give people who are interested in estate planning the fundamental training that they needed so they can then be a feeder to go to the Institute. Actually, he said that way I know they'll come to the Institute and I can generate more people. But and what was interesting, in 1981, when Congress raised the exemption from 175,000 to 600,000, Phil said, that's the end of estate planning. And he was really worried that with $600,000 of exemption, nobody would need estate planning. Because remember, 1981, things were different. Gasoline was still, 50, 60 cents a gallon. And so what happened is, for the 1982 Institute, which was the first institute after the 81 Act, they had the biggest attendance ever because people wanted to know. And Phil said, it's a good thing I didn't terminate the Institute. Unfortunately, Phil developed melanoma and died of cancer early in 1982. But Phil's protege, who was like the assistant director of the Estate Planning Institute, was Professor John Galbatz. And I was there too. So what happened when Phil died in 1982, the dean of the law school appointed Galbatz to head the institute and for me to run the master's program in estate planning. And fortunately, John was brought to Miami by Soya Metchikoff, who taught him at the University of Chicago. But when John took over, he understood Phil's vision. And while John was the director of the Institute from, I think, 82 to 94, he continued Phil's vision. Unfortunately, it outgrew the Sheraton Bell Harbor, so they went over to the Fontainebleau. And it was nice in the Fontainebleau because it was closer, easier to get to. But that was Phil's vision, to make sure that the estate planning profession has available all of the information from the greatest minds in the country, and so they can practice at the highest level of technical competence, moral and ethical competence as well. There was one other thing Phil liked to do.
And this is the last thing, because we're running out of time.
Well, I could go on with Phil Heckerling stories forever. There was another thing
Wrap it up.
Phil Heckerling liked to do. He said, I always want to give young people who nobody knows a chance to speak on a national platform so that they can make their reputations. Now, there was actually an ulterior motive, because when you get some of these big name speakers, they just redo the same outlines. You get a young person and give them the first opportunity, they're going to work their tail off to do a great paper and a great speech. And so we owe this wonderful institute, which Tina has taken on to the next level, because Tina also put in the fundamental stuff so people can actually understand when Covey speaks, that they get the background. So we really owe Phil a debt of gratitude. His vision over these years has made the University of Miami Institute one of the most premier institutes in the country, and we are so indebted and grateful to Phil, because that was his view of the profession and what he needed to do for the profession.
Well, Jerry, thank you for being there with him and supporting him and making that happen after he left. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, and thanks for everything you've done for the profession. So many of the people here have been your students, and you've been their mentors, and you're there for them. You've certainly followed in Phil's footsteps in a great way.
My goal is to continue Phil's mission.
And you're doing it beautifully.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Interactive Legal, and all the viewers, and Phil Heckerling.